Did Plato predict AI? Spoiler alert, no, a man born, 3,000 years ago did not write about the invention of large language models. That said, I was listening to Machine Learning Street Talk, one of my favorite podcasts right now, where I came across this idea a philosopher proposed about how Plato's theory of forms and nature are extremely aligned. I can't remember the exact specifics of the podcast, but it made me realize just how similar a lot of Plato's hypotheses are to the current AI landscape, and how he essentially predicted this whole LLM algorithm. So, I dusted off my old copy of The Republic to refresh myself on the forms and all of Plato's hypothesis, and to summarize, I really can't believe just how similar some of the hypotheses in this book that were proposed before Christ have started to come to fruition today. As usual, I'm Jaustin, and this is BM Blogs. This is going to be sort of a different video than usual. Instead of my traditional video essays where I put a lot of time into the edits, in this video I'm not really talking about any contemporary theories, and I'm more or less just riffing on my own thoughts regarding Plato and AI. So I don't feel as compelled to spend a lot of time to make these theories legit, I guess, so to speak. So anyways, I'm treating this like a podcast. Let's get on with it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. All of us at one point or another have scrolled Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube after a long days of work. We've all seen the blue light of a high-resolution screen numb the last neurons of energy in our eyes. Nowadays, the reels of travel vloggers bustling through the streets of Peru, or the OnlyFans ads of Instagram models, or the live streams of influencers seem more prevalent and closer to reality than an old memory. Except nowadays, the so-called reality never existed. For all we know, the OnlyFans models, the influencers, and everything else that makes up our screens on a day-to-day basis might not be real. For all we know, we just watched a sequence of pixels predicted by a GPU, a quote-unquote shadow cast not by a physical object, but by a massive cluster of numbers in a data center. In other words, an AI model. It's not until we see these subtle, uncanny moments, like a person with 6 fingers on their hand, or a reflection in the window that doesn't make complete sense, where we begin to see these images for what they are, mere representations of reality instead of reality itself. These are the modern versions of what Plato called shadows. More on the shadows later. Nowadays, the viewer isn't a passive observer of these shadows. With one single prompt, we can change our so-called reality on the wall. We are becoming the puppeteers of our own cave, so to speak. Yet the cave is still as dark as ever. If you've never heard of Plato's Allegory of the cave, that analogy may have been a bit foreign to you. This is a famous treatise written by the Greek philosopher Plato roughly 2,500 years ago that argues we as humans are bound like prisoners to forever see life in fragments as opposed to what reality truly is if we as a society forego knowledge for a consensus of sorts. Plato's Allegory of the cave is as follows. Imagine a group of people who have lived in a cave since childhood. They are chained in this cave, facing a blank wall, unable to turn their heads. This blank wall, this so-called screen, is all the prisoners have ever known. However, behind the prisoners' back is this great fire ran by quote-unquote puppeteers. These puppeteers carry walkways across the back of the fire, statues of animals, of trees, of people, so that the fire casts their shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners, in front of their screen. Because the prisoners can't see the real objects behind them, they give the shadows these real names like dogs and trees or people or justice. They believe the flickering backs of the shadows of the fire are true reality. They see them for what they are. When a puppeteer speaks, for example, the sound echoes off the wall, but because the prisoners don't know the puppeteers are there, to the prisoners, it sounds like the shadow itself is talking. The prisoner's entire world is this low-resolution, second-hand projection of the world. Plato's Allegory asks the question, what happens if a prisoner is freed? They would turn around, no longer seeing the screen on the wall of the cave, be blinded by the fire, and realize that these shadows weren't real. They were fakes. They were representations created by the puppeteers. If they were dragged out of this cave into the actual sun, this transition would be a painful ascent where they're blinded by the light and the heat, but they would finally see reality for what it is. Plato used a term called the forms to represent this real reality, life outside of the cave. More on the forms in a second. In essence, Plato is trying to tell us through the allegory of the cave that knowledge is a painful undertaking, and that most of us choose to be the prisoners and choose to enslave ourselves to these representations of reality rather than what reality truly is. To Plato, what reality truly is the forms. The theory of forms. In Plato's world, every single material thing is only a flawed copy of the true thing. What does that mean? For example, in Plato's world, there's no such thing as a true chair in the material world. The chair you're sitting on, the chair I'm sitting on, are called flawed copies of the singular, perfect form of a chair that exists in some higher dimensional realm, the forms. In our world, no two chairs are the same as one another. One is wobbly, one is plastic, one is missing a leg. But in our minds, we still have the standard, the set definition of what a chair is. We can look at a beanbag chair, for example, and an office chair and still recognize they're both chairs. However, in this perfect world of the forms, this so-called realm of the ideas, Plato argued that this standard form exists in a non-physical realm. There is this eternal, unchanging form of a chair that exists outside. Everything we see with our own eyes is just a glitchy imitation of that perfect form. We recognize a chair not because it's made out of wood or metal or because it has 4 legs or whatever you have it, but because it participates in the ideal form of chairiness. We know this looks closer to a chair than the desk I'm working on right now because there's no set definition, but it's innate to us because of this realm of forms that we all are interacting with every day. Now, this is exactly what generative AI is accomplishing. Stick with me. By processing millions of flawed images of chairs, for example, the model distills them into this mathematical essence of what a chair means. When we train an AI on 10 million images of chairs, like we all do when we're registering a website that is blocked by Cloudflare, for example, we aren't asking it to memorize all those 10 million chairs. We're asking it to find all of the commonalities between them. The AI looks at a 1970s beanbag and a Victorian throne, and it discards the noise, the specific colors, the form, the dust on the lens, the background, and all it does is keep the signal, aka the chairiness, the form. After training the AI has essentially found this form. When you type chair into an image generator, it isn't picking a photo from its memory, it's projecting its mathematical understanding of what it means to be a chair, aka the chairiness, onto the screen. In other words, AI doesn't see objects. It sees the vectors of objects, the digital forms, as Plato came up with 2,500 years ago. While a human sees a chair and thinks of sitting, an AI sees a chair and thinks of a coordinate. What do I mean by a coordinate? I mean a set of plots on this 3D graph. To the AI, the essence of a thing is a distance from other things. A chair is just a point in space that is far from a cloud, but a lot closer to a table, for example. If you were to map out every single definition, every word, every form of meaning in the world, that is how AI sees the world in front of us. The way AI views meaning starts to make more sense when you view it from the smoking gun equation. This famous equation, I forget who invented it, but distorts how we calculate meaning. So take the word king. What happens when you subtract the word man from a king? You're left with royalty. Someone who is a royal status, but they don't have a defined gender, so you can't call them a king or a queen. So take that defined aspect of king, subtract man from it, you're left with royalty. Then what happens if you add woman to it? Royalty plus woman equal a queen. This is how AI computes meaning in language and math. AI doesn't understand any of these concepts. It doesn't understand a king, queen, man, or woman, but it does understand the mathematical relation to them. The implication is that AI didn't learn that a queen is a female king because of a dictionary or anything like that. It did so by discovering the underlying structure between these concepts. The kingness, the queenness, the manness, the womanness, in the same way we talked about with the chairness earlier. This is a digital world of forms. For the first time ever, Plato's theory of forms isn't a symbol of this abstract heaven, but a very real version of latent space created by GPUs. We have turned abstract philosophy into a real higher dimensional map that we can now navigate. The complete Plato fanboy in me wants to get up and be like, holy shit, we are living in a time where Plato's theory of forms is coming to reality. That is probably maybe the coolest time ever to be alive. But we also have to be realistic about this and actually think about what this means for us if we are truly living in a world of forms. If through latent space, AI is building this mathematics of meaning, this digital world of forms, what happens when it starts utilizing the content it produces to help build the coordinates of its forms? To be more specific, as we flood the internet with AI content, and whether it's AI Photoshop photos of us in a bathing suit or a bikini, or it's completely AI generated art, what happens when AI starts using that data to build the coordinates for the forms? Using AI data to build coordinates of reality, so to speak. We would essentially be looking at not just the shadows Plato talks about in the Allegory of a cave, but shadows of shadows, because they're building on top of one another. We would have one flawed essence of a meaning built on top of another flawed essence of meaning, and so forth. If the shadows are built on top of another shadows, they become increasingly distorted, and they will lose their connection to the original source. For example, if AI's concept of beauty in this latent space is so far removed from what humans see as beautiful, are they even forms in the first place, or do they represent something else entirely? Then again, what if AI continues to get so good and better, and we no longer see AI-generated images of people with 6 fingers or a reflection looking off, that essentially the shadows look perfect to the naked human eye? What happens then? Is that the so-called singularity all these AI theorists love to ponder about? If everything we see in our reality, our advertisements, our phone screens, our connections are built off AI shadows, are we not literally living in Plato's theory of forms or world of forms? If AI maps out every single relationship, from the spin of an electron to the nuance of what nostalgia means to the human, it is arguably found the so-called blueprint for the universe, aka Plato's world of forms. That question just opened up a whole can of worms for my brain, so bear with me. I'm going to bring up a few more philosophers, and yeah, all right, where do I start? Another way of framing the question, are we living in Plato's world of forms, is as such. Can reality and life as we know it actually be captured by mathematics? Or is there something bigger to life, some human or metaphysical element that we can't capture with graphs and paper and equations? There's 2 schools of thought for this. There's the Rationalists and the Empiricists. The Rationalists are led by philosophers like Wilhelm Leibniz. I'm not familiar enough with Leibniz's theories to actually draw them out here, but I suggest you look them up. But Leibniz basically argued that, yes, the whole universe could be captured in mathematics, and that everything can be calculated. On the other side, there's the Empiricists, which is led by philosophers like David Hume, for example. And same thing, I can't remember enough of his theories to give a proper breakdown, but David Hume would argue that there's this essence that AI can't capture. For example, AI can understand what it means to feel heat, to feel hot, but it can't truly live that experience until it has went through the experience itself. For lack of a better word, there's something that happens when humans experience something that AI will never be able to mathematically conjure. However, after Hume and Leibniz, another philosopher started making waves, and he basically combined the 2 theories, the rationalists and the empiricists. To Immanuel Kant, just like Hume and Leibniz. I'm sorry, I can't give the perfect rendition of his ideas off the top of my head, but what I can say is Kant basically combined the rationalist and empiricist belief and said that even if Leibniz is right, even if there's a mathematical conjuring of the universe as we know it that is mapped perfectly and no human can see a difference, it still isn't the simulacra. It still isn't a simulation of reality itself. It's still missing something because by its very nature, it's an invention. We know where it came from, I guess. We know how it occurred. Unlike reality as we know it, there's some mystical big bang element to it that cannot be explained at this very moment in history, at least. I mentioned Kant because it's the first part of his theory that interests me. Kant says that we will reach a time where AI is indistinguishable from reality. We will be able to map out the forms perfectly and no human will be able to define a difference. What happens then? What happens when the AI shadows, as Plato once called them, are so accurate they become indistinguishable from the true form? We currently recognize AI by its hallucinations or its uncanniness, its six fingers, as I said before, the weirdness. But what happens when that error rate hits zero? There's no more six fingers. There's no more weird mirror reflections. There's no more hallucinations when getting it to write an essay. Imagine an AI-generated world where the physics are perfect. The light bounces off surfaces exactly as it does in nature, and every human interaction feels remarkably real. If these shadows on the screen are indistinguishable from the forms of reality, our brains stop making the distinction. The cave becomes the only world we know because there's no longer a reason to look for the exit. If that's hard to believe, just think to a far lesser degree what happened when you were a kid watching a horror movie. You would feel emotionally scared, and that was a real feeling, even though it was conjured by a simulation, a representation, an image on the screen. The Borgesian paradox is in reference to the short kid story written by Jorge Luis Borges in the 1800s, I believe. And basically, the story is as follows. It describes an empire where they are obsessed with the art of cartography, making maps, detailing maps of the world. They want to explore the whole world, and in order to do so, you got to make maps of the world. Basically, what happens, the art of cartography in this so-called empire became so detailed, they made a map of the world they live in that is 1-for-1 in scale to the actual world. And the map was so big, it covered literally every territory, every minuscule of land, and it was meant to represent, over time, the land underneath it. But over time, the land underneath it was no longer kept because people lived on the map, and the map became the reality. And the land, the real land under them, rotted and wilted away and became a husk of its former self. But people had no idea because they lived on the map, the cartography land, the representation of land. Philosophers in the postmodern era, like Baudrillard, for example, have loved to use this story to describe the hyperreal and what is now happening with AI in latent space. Basically, AI is a latent space. The coordinates are making between all these maps of meaning, the cherryness, the kingness, the womanness, etc. is that map. As we automate our art through AI and everything in between, our history, our conversations, we are laying a digital map over our physical lives. Eventually, we won't be living in the real empire anymore. We are going to be living in the map, or at least the majority of our life is going to resemble the map as opposed to reality. In real life, you can see that all too common. People spend more time on social media than they do touching grass, so to speak. I believe Kant is right. I believe we are literally watching the collapse of the world of forms and latent space. We are literally watching the world of forms take reality in front of us and grab it from our very hands. We are no longer just watching the shadows anymore, as Plato's Allegory, the cave insists. We are living inside the equation and perpetuating our own shadows. What does living in the equation mean? It means our social media, our jobs, our creative lives are all fed back into this model to update the map. We have to become the data points. In order for me to talk about this theory that excites me, I have to put it on YouTube and give it to the algorithm and let LLMs dissect it all they want. The real question is, though, is a perfect shadow still a shadow? If the AI can predict your next thought, your next move, and your next form, have you escaped the cave, or have you just become part of the fire? In essence, the age of information ushered in the world of forms to take over reality as we know it. I think it's a mistake to look at it emotionally, whether pessimistically or optimistically, but instead, what we as humans can do is just brace for the challenge. With that said, to answer my original question, I do believe Plato did predict AI. If you like videos like these where I just sort of riff instead of writing a full-on script and editing full-length video essays, please let me know in the comments and like and subscribe. Specifically in the comments, like give me a feedback, opinions. I'd love to hear how you guys thought this went. This is sort of new for me, so thank you guys.